On this Wednesday night, a critical point at the climate summit. There's a draft deal at COP26, but what's missing from it?
We need much more concrete action.
And a surprise new pledge from two of the world's worst polluters. The excruciating effect of postponing surgery.
I'm not having this hysterectomy just because.
How long it could take to clear the backlog of surgeries delayed by COVID. Murderous motive, what may have inspired the man accused of running down a Muslim family in London, Ontario. A Global News exclusive. And a century-old tale of bravery.
From all accounts, he was a very good guy.
The long-lost letter that reveals a Canadian airman's poignant story.
Global National with Donna Friesen.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. Time is running out for the nearly 200 countries at the UN Climate Summit to agree on what they'll do to keep a lid on rising temperatures. A draft agreement released today sets the stage for last-minute negotiations now underway. It urges countries to revisit and strengthen their targets. It says vulnerable nations must get more help to cope with the deadly impacts of global warming and calls on countries to accelerate the phasing out of coal and subsidies for fossil fuels, but has no firm dates or targets. Scientists have warned that keeping temperature rises to 1.5 degrees Celsius, beyond which the worst impacts of climate change will be felt, requires global emissions to be cut by 45% by 2030 and down to zero by 2050. We are not on target to meet that now. It is clear there's a sense of urgency, and today China and the U.S., the two largest emitters in the world, promise to work together on cutting emissions. Goomansingh has our top story tonight.
With the clock ticking down in Glasgow, a preview today at how far negotiators have come in hammering out a new climate deal. The draft document urges countries to ramp up efforts to phase out coal and fossil fuel subsidies. But critics are warning it's not enough.
We need much more concrete action to be sure that we actually really meet this 1.5 target.
Activists say the 6-page draft lacks clear deadlines and is short on specifics as to how key areas will be addressed. There's also no language requiring countries to be transparent about their progress.
What we need to do is to streamline the text, because the best decision is a short decision that is clear for everybody and there is no room for alternate facts or alternate interpretation.
Boris Johnson reappeared at the summit Wednesday as the draft copy of the Glasgow Agreement landed with a thud. He's urging countries to pull out all the stops to limit global warming.
Will you help us grasp that opportunity, or will you stand in the way?
Developing nations bearing the brunt of the crisis say they need more support. They've been clear they need wealthier nations to step up financially. The draft calls on countries to urgently scale up climate financing, but no deadlines are attached.
I think it's important to recognize that ambition also requires acknowledging that there is inadequate adaptation and financial efforts to tackle the impacts of the climate crisis.
With just 2 days to go, a positive signal. The world's two largest emitters, the U.S. and China, announced a surprise deal to work together to tackle climate change.
Together, we set out our support for a successful COP26.
Now it's up to negotiators to get firm commitments on paper.
I still think we can achieve it, but I'm not going to pretend to you that it is by any means a done deal.
Johnson has already hinted talks could extend past Friday. Goomansingh, Global News, London.
In Ontario, the 7-day average of daily new COVID-19 cases has risen above 500 again, and that's led the province to delay lifting capacity limits for higher-risk settings like nightclubs and wedding halls. The province's top doctor says Ontario, though, is still on the right track.
Ontarians are still adhering to all the best practices, unlike other places where they've taken on and then taken off and then had to put back in public health measures. We've remained constant.
Ontario's 7-day average for new cases is up 44% since the beginning of November, but hospital and ICU numbers have remained stable. In Alberta and Saskatchewan, COVID-19 case counts are now coming down after a punishing fourth wave. Intensive care units were so overwhelmed, some patients were transferred out of province and thousands of surgeries were delayed. As Heather Yourex-West explains, it could take months to clear the backlog.
For Leah Crawford, a difficult fourth wave of COVID-19 led to 4 additional months of pain.
It's unimaginable because, I'm in enough pain as it is. I'm not having this hysterectomy just because, I'm having it for a reason.
The Calgary woman, one of thousands to have a surgery postponed as Alberta struggled to cope with a surge in COVID patients that nearly brought the health system to its knees. With that surge now subsiding, doctors are once again in the OR, though the system is nowhere near back to full capacity.
I'm still operating only a fraction of the time I normally operate. So I anticipate it'll take months before we're able to work through the backlog, for sure.
It's been very difficult to find operative time to deal with these cancers that have a tendency to grow very quickly.
Dr. Oliver Baith treats GI, liver, and pancreatic cancer patients with often aggressive tumors that may have seen their disease spread during the delay.
That's too soon to tell. I think it'll be a long time before we understand fully what the impact of this is on people's cancer prognosis.
Alberta Health Services is now prioritizing pediatric and cancer patients, but the backlog for other surgeries may take longer to clear. Last week, the Saskatchewan Health Authority's CEO said it could be 18 months before that province is able to perform orthopedic surgeries again.
I think it's going to be tremendously hard. We were already working in a system that was restrained in terms of the number of surgeries and meeting surgical targets in terms of wait times for surgeries.
With thousands of additional patients now in the queue, the surgery backlog represents another wave of extraordinary health system strain. Heather Yourex-West, Global News, Calgary.
COVID-19 cases are rising in the Northwest Territories. There are more than 50 active cases in the region now, but a third of them are in Tuktoyaktuk. Health officials believe there's community transmission there in a community of about 900. A 10-day lockdown has now been ordered in hopes of slowing the spread of the virus.
And please, I'm begging you, get vaccinated.
And Yukon's premier says there is now widespread and untraceable community transmission of COVID-19 in Whitehorse. The territory declared a state of emergency on Monday. New restrictions will be enforced beginning Saturday, including a mandatory proof of vaccination requirement for people aged 12 and over. The territory has the highest rate of active cases in the country. The leader of the Green Party of Canada, Annamie Paul, has formally resigned and she has quit the party. In a tweet today, Paul said, "It was an honor to work for the people of Canada and I look forward to serving in new ways." Paul was at the helm for just 1 year. It was tumultuous. She dealt with infighting within the party over her leadership and lost her own riding in the federal election. After a 5-year pause, there's going to be a sequel to the so-called Three Amigos summit. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and Mexican President López Obrador will be the guests of U.S. President Joe Biden in Washington. Jackson Proskow joins me from there now. Jackson, they've met before virtually, I guess, but this will be the first time in person. What's on the agenda?
Well, that's right, Donna. Officially, the leaders are set to talk about issues like climate change, migration, and ending the pandemic. But it's what they are not advertising that will likely dominate the meeting, namely the impacts of Biden's Buy American policies on Canadian and Mexican companies. Both countries are looking for exemptions there. There's also concern about a U.S. tax credit program on electric vehicles that cuts out foreign-made cars. Again, that's a serious concern for the Canadian auto sector. Then there's the fate of Enbridge Line 5, that pipeline that faces court challenges here in the United States. And of course, you can expect a collective push from Canada and Mexico for Biden to develop some sort of North American strategy for standing up to China.
The question will be whether Biden will take up their cause. And that's one of the challenges in North America. It seems as though it's three amigos, all for one and one for all, when the U.S. wants Canada and Mexico to toe the line. But when Canada and Mexico want something, it sometimes seems like, well, it's America first, even under Biden.
Interesting. Well, Jackson, Canada and the U.S. do have a solid relationship, but domestic pressures do take precedence all the time. Is that much different under President Biden than it was under Trump?
So far, no, and I think that could lead to some real pressure behind the scenes to develop a more reciprocal relationship. That's something that completely vanished in the Trump years and really has not been rebuilt in the first year of the Biden presidency. Both Canada and Mexico are likely to look for some sort of signal that Biden supports their interests and is willing to strengthen those ties. But of course, the politics are very complicated here, as you mentioned, Donna, and this summit is happening at a time when Biden's domestic popularity has plummeted and Democrats in Congress have struggled to get things done. In other words, there may be only so much that Biden can bend on.
All right, Jackson Proskow in Washington, thanks. In the U.S., there is a clear indication how fast prices are rising. Inflation has hit the highest rate in 3 decades. The Consumer Price Index, the amount people pay for goods and services, recorded a 6.2% increase year over year in October, the fastest annual pace since 1990. The price of nearly everything is up, but the biggest rises are energy costs, shelter, food, and vehicles. The combination of a tight labor market, supply chain problems, and increasing consumer demand are pushing up prices. Higher inflation has persisted much longer than most economists predicted. They do think it will begin to slow once supply bottlenecks clear. The U.S. House committee investigating the January 6th attack on the Capitol have been given access to former President Donald Trump's White House records. A judge rejected Trump's request to block the release of the documents, writing that presidents are not kings and the plaintiff is not president. The hundreds of pages could shed light on the violent attack by Trump's supporters. There are call logs, drafts of speeches, and notes from Trump's then chief of staff. Barring a court order, they could be turned over to the committee as soon as Friday. Trump's lawyers plan to appeal, so the case will likely head to the U.S. Supreme Court. There is some new insight tonight into what may have influenced the man accused of killing a Muslim family in London, Ontario in June. Global News has learned investigators found written information that appears to show he was inspired by the gunman who killed 51 people at 2 New Zealand mosques in 2019. As Mike Drolet reports, it could explain why Canadian officials modified the charges against him soon after the attack.
There was never a doubt as to what happened in the early evening of June 6th in London, Ontario. A Muslim Canadian family out for a stroll was killed, allegedly run over by a truck driven by Nathaniel Veltman. As police built their case, the why was hinted at but never fully explained, even though the Muslim community had made up its mind.
They all know what it was. There was no doubt right from the get-go that this was an act of terror.
Global News has now learned from multiple sources that police found a large volume of ideological writings in the suspect's truck, home, and computer, which allegedly showed he was heavily influenced by Brenton Tarrant, who live-streamed a portion of his attack on 2 mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand in 2019. Police also found documents allegedly written by Veltman that referenced Tarrant, which may explain why Veltman later became the first person charged under Canada's anti-terrorism laws for an alleged Islamophobic act.
I can't keep showing up at funerals and learning afterwards about how they were motivated, how much white supremacist literature did they consume. I don't want to do that anymore, and I know that Canadian Muslims don't want to do that anymore, and that's why it has to stop, it has to change.
But the opposite appears to be true. A report from Canada's Integrated Terrorism Assessment Centre, acquired by Global News through the Freedom of Information Act, points to manifestos becoming far more common with extremists and are meant to resonate with like-minded individuals. Tarrant's manifesto in particular has inspired others.
He also laced his manifesto with jokes and irony, things that would appeal to the internet generation, things that are kind of inside jokes in certain chat rooms. And so even while he displayed this incredible level of barbarity, he's still doing it with a wink and a nod to internet culture. And I think that really resonated with the far right.
Our call is simple. No more violence.
Earlier this week, the National Council of Canadian Muslims released our London Family Act, which would target Islamophobia through education and accountability. They want the Ontario government to act urgently. Mike Drolet, Global News, Toronto.
Canadian Catholic bishops say they plan to send a small delegation to Rome next month when Indigenous leaders meet with Pope Francis. In a statement, the bishops say 25 to 30 First Nations, Inuit and Métis elders, knowledge keepers, residential school survivors, and youth will meet with Pope Francis at the Vatican from December 17th to 20th. The Pope will participate in private meetings with them. Well, even prime ministers face distractions when working from home.
Oh, it is. I'm sorry, darling. It is taking so long. Okay.
Coming up, how a 3-year-old asserted herself during a live briefing. Working from home can be tricky for parents of young kids, even when you're Prime Minister. New Zealand's Prime Minister Jacinda Arderns was giving a live update about COVID-19 when this happened.
You're meant to be in bed, darling. It's bedtime, darling. Pop back to bed. I'll come and see you in a second. I'll come and see you in a minute, okay? Sorry, everybody. Well, that was a bedtime fail, wasn't it? Sorry, everyone. I thought here's a moment. I'll do a Facebook Live. We're nice and safe.
Arderns tried to continue, but 3-year-olds can be persistent.
Oh, it is. I'm sorry, darling. It is taking so long. Okay. I'm sorry, everyone. I'm going to just go and put Neve back to bed because this is well past her bedtime.
It's not the first time she's had to keep her cool. Last month, an earthquake hit while she was in the middle of a press conference. She just gripped the podium and called it a slight distraction. The push to recognize Canada's Punjabi soldiers ahead their pivotal role in the First World War. There are lots of forgotten or overlooked stories in Canada's military history. One is about the role of Punjabi troops, especially during the First World War. Few are aware of the critical role they played in a pivotal battle. Now a historian is advocating for long overdue recognition. Neetho Garcha explains.
After 4 days without respite, it was these Indian soldiers who were called in by the Canadians as reinforcements in the Second Battle of Ypres on April 26, 1915, helping to stop the advance of German forces.
Without the participation of the Punjabi soldiers, Ypres would have been lost. The Canadian forces wouldn't have actually been able to hold the line at Ypres.
In a war, about 1.3 million Indian soldiers served in, more than Canadians, Australians and New Zealanders combined.
We literally have Punjabi, the kin of the Punjabi that are on the Komagata fighting to defend the Canadian line in Flanders.
Through this exhibit at the Museum of Surrey, BC historian Stephen Purawal is sharing these often forgotten stories of selfless service, a pillar of the faith these Sikh Vancouver police officers say motivates them.
I think our faith plays a major role in that, and it's a part of our fabric is to serve the community.
The men that fought in that war ensured that I could stand here today with a turban and a beard in a Vancouver Police Department uniform.
Both officers are also part of this heritage film, written and directed by Purawal. But like his efforts to have the untold stories of Sikh soldiers incorporated into social studies curriculums across Canada, he's run into barriers.
We're still looking for more funding. What are the priorities?
It is a common experience, too, of being colonials.
He's also turned this exhibit into a book, which he's giving to every Canadian MP.
I did not understand before coming here that India had the second largest standing army at the time of World War I to Britain.
Especially on the 100-year anniversary of the poppy, coinciding with the 50th anniversary of Canada's first multiculturalism policy, Purawal says it's time to correct the narrative.
Which I feel has a Eurocentric lens to the detriment of many minority communities.
Neetho Garcha, Global News, Surrey, BC.
Up next, a long-lost letter reveals what happened to a young Canadian pilot after his plane went down. We observe Remembrance Day every November 11th because it marks the end of the First World War. Well, this next story is about a pilot who was injured just before it ended. As he lay in a British hospital, his sister came to visit from Canada, and she sent a letter home. That letter is now helping his family bring his story to life. Redmond Shannon reports.
Dear Marjorie, I hardly know how to write to you, for as you will know, it is not easy for me to go through everything again.
A century-old letter telling a heartbreaking tale of First World War pilot Lieutenant James Gordon Moore.
As my grandmother says, Gordon and his machine.
Maureen Kitchen's grandmother was Moore's cousin. In 1916, the 21-year-old enlisted for the war. flying bombing missions into Germany with Britain's Royal Flying Corps, and later becoming a test pilot.
From all accounts, he was a very good guy. His sisters all obviously adored him.
Just 3 weeks before the war ended, Moore's plane crashed in France. He was thrown clear, but was horribly burned when trying to save the Australian co-pilot. His older sister, Thurza, sailed from Canada to England to be with him at his bedside. After 10 long months of suffering, Lieutenant Moore died in a London hospital. A grieving Thurza wrote to her sister Marjorie about Gordon's final days.
He often said to me that he couldn't bear to have people see him. He was so sensitive, and really I do feel Gordon was happy to go. He was so peaceful. I stayed with him and I held him for a long time, but I knew he was going. He was so thin and had failed so terribly. They told me to leave him as they didn't want me to see him die. So I kissed him and he said, yes, goodbye.
Maureen found the letter in her parents' house a decade ago, unearthing a family pain sealed for decades inside an envelope.
I know how hard it will be to us, as Gordon was everything to us, but we must not be selfish and wish him back, for he has surely had his suffering. Gordon was simply worshipped by the flyers over here, and they never stopped talking about his bravery.
The letter details Moore's full military funeral at this London cemetery.
You could tell in that letter that really helped them deal with the fact that he was gone. He did not die in vain.
Maureen believes his 4 sisters were never the same again. Their only solace, that Gordon was finally at peace. Redmond Shannon, Global News, London.
And that's Global National for this Wednesday. I'm Donna Friesen. As we prepare for Remembrance Day, we leave you tonight with photos from the National Military Cemetery in Ottawa, the final resting place for thousands of Canadians who have given their lives in service to this country. Thanks for watching. Hope to see you here again tomorrow. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.